Okay, in the previous slideshow, I introduced Frege's first puzzle, and you'll recall that his solution to that puzzle said this, that meaning is complex, it has two aspects, those being sense and reference. That invites the question, what is reference and what is sense? In the next series of videos, we'll talk about what is reference for names, what is reference for sense, and what is reference for sentences, and what is sense for sentences. So let's start with reference for names. Here you have Mark Twain. Mark Twain, in case you don't know, was the pen name of Samuel Clemens. And we have a sentence, Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn, and a competing sentence, Samuel Clemens wrote Huckleberry Finn. And what does the word name Mark Twain refer to? Well, it refers to the guy in the world. What does the name Samuel Clemens refer to? It refers to the same guy in the world. And that's, since they refer to the same guy in the world, it's true when we say Mark Twain is identical with Samuel Clemens. Now, I have these arrows pointing at a picture, not at the actual guy. I don't have the guy present to point at. But let's just suppose this is the actual guy for ease of presentation. Okay, the reference for a name is the individual itself, the thing in the world you're referring to. Since the reference is the individual itself, one expects reference and truth conditions to be deeply related, since, presuming there's a unique author here, these sentences are both true only if the names have the same reference. That is, if whether Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn is true depends on whether this guy, the thing referred to, wrote Huckleberry Finn. And similarly, whether Samuel Clemens wrote Huckleberry Finn is true depends on whether this guy, the thing referred to, wrote Huckleberry Finn. So since Mark Twain the name and Samuel Clemens the name refer to the same guy, and the rest of this sentence is the same as the rest of this sentence, it follows that this sentence and this sentence have the same truth conditions. And that's why we would expect reference and truth conditions to be closely tied. That's the basic idea. Okay, what is a sense for names? Well, this is much harder to answer. At first, rough pass, you can think of the sense of a name as something like a description that you associate with the referent, a description you associate with the thing you're referring to. So what do we know about these, about senses? Frege says they're public. What does that mean? It means there's something that can be shared between us. There's something that I can convey to you. Now, you might think like, okay, that's not very interesting. But the important idea here is to contrast senses with what Frege thinks of as mere ideas. So an idea is something like the sensory impression that you associate with the referent. And he thinks these can't be public. Why can't they be public? Well, look, he's worried about inverted spectrum. He's worried that your red might be my blue. And it's not just for color, it's for shape and size and so on and so forth. That is, the particular qualitative content of my sensory experience in response to, say, Mark Twain, might be different than the particular qualitative content of your sensory experience in response to Mark Twain. Correspondingly, we might associate different ideas with Mark Twain. You, your sensory experience, me, my sensory experience, and those might not match up. And if what I'm expressing, what I'm conveying when I say Mark Twain is my idea, is my sensory impression, and your sensory impression doesn't match mine, then when I say Mark Twain and you take me to mean what to be conveying the image that you sort of bring to mind when you think of Mark Twain, we're miscommunicating because there's different ideas that, the idea I'm conveying doesn't match the one that you're kind of taking in. So Frege thinks senses can't be ideas, but instead have to be something public, something that will allow for successful communication. And he offers an analogy to get his idea across. He says, imagine someone looking through a telescope at an object in the sky. Let's make it the moon. The moon, the object in the sky, is the referent, just like the name Mark Twain refers to the guy in the world, Mark Twain. And in your mind, you have some idea. That's your perceptual experience of the object, your perceptual experience of the moon. And then the sense, he says, is like the image on the end of the telescope. Notice that whereas the idea, the qualitative content of your experience is kind of a private thing that may differ from someone else's, we can't sort of point to anything public and say that's what's shared. The image on the end of the telescope is not a private thing, it's public. It's something that in principle we can point at and say that's what's shared. So let's bring someone out here and have her say the moon is out, and she has an image of the moon in her head when she says this, which may or may not match the image other people have when they hear her say the moon is out. Frege calls that image in your head the qualitative content of your sensory experience, the idea. He says the moon refers to this thing. So this is what he calls the reference. I mentioned in class that it's better to say the referent and think of reference as a relation between bits of language and things in the world. And so reference is the relation and the referent is the thing referred to. Where is the analog of the image on the end of the telescope? That is where in this picture over here is the analog. You can't draw it over here because Frege thinks that it's like a Platonic form, as someone in class put it, that it inhabits what he called the third realm, that it's an abstract entity. Now let's further characterize the relations here. The relation between idea and the reference is subjective. And since it's subjective, you can never be confident that my idea matches yours. So if the idea is what determines reference, we can never be confident that we refer to the same thing. By contrast, the relation between what's on the end of the telescope and the moon is objective. And consequently, if the relation between what's communicated, sense, and the object in the world, the moon, is like that, then we can be confident that we're talking about the same thing, that we're referring to the same thing when we talk. Okay. All right, I already said that. Okay, so what else do we know about senses? Well, everyone who understands a name grasps the sense. It's a constitutive of understanding the name that you can grasp the sense. So if you can't grasp the sense, it just follows that you don't really understand the name, that it's not really, you're not really a competent user of that expression in language. So we have someone here who says the moon is out. If she understands the word moon, then she knows its sense. Very roughly, that implies that she can think of a description that picks out the moon uniquely. Now, this is the first time I introduced this idea of a description that picks something out uniquely, but the idea is something like this. If she really understands the word moon, then she can, and you say, what is the moon? She can say, well, the moon is the object in the sky that's, typically appears white, often visible, most often visible during the night. It goes from circular to crescent shaped throughout the month, and so on and so forth. She can give a description such that the only object that satisfies it is the referent of that description. So, for example, perhaps she can think the moon is the largest object in the sky that glows white at night. Most nights appear sometimes as a circle, and so on. Okay, so the next thing to note is that for any name, for any given sense, there is at most one referent. But for each referent, there may be many senses. So here's the idea. Let's take a name like Mark Twain. Well, there may be more than one sense associated with the name Mark Twain. But for any given sense associated with the name Mark Twain, there's going to be exactly one referent. Otherwise, Mark Twain isn't a name. Now, not every bit of language is a name. There are general terms, kind terms like desk and table and moons and person. And for each of those, there may be more than one referent. But for a name, there can be at most one referent, even though there can be distinct senses. So you might think of it like this. Take the name Mark Twain. The author of Huckleberry Finn might be the sense you associate with the name Mark Twain, or capture the sense. The author of Tom Sawyer might be the sense that I associate with the name Mark Twain. So that's two different senses associated with a single name. But what's crucial is each of those senses is sufficient to pick out a unique referent, to pick out a single referent out there in the world. Now, for any given referent, ideally there would be one sense for each name, but natural language isn't ideal, so we can't have that. That's ideal because it would avoid all sorts of miscommunication. So when I say the author of, when I say Mark Twain and I mean the author of Huckleberry Finn, I may intend to convey to you that he wrote Huckleberry Finn, but since you think of the author of Tom Sawyer, you might sort of receive something different than what I intended to convey. But since we can make these descriptions public, we can determine whether the senses that we're conveying match one another or not. Whereas with ideas, since those are sort of essentially private, we can't even in principle determine whether we're successfully communicating or not. The final thing I want to mention about senses is this, that full knowledge of the referent would require us to be able to say immediately whether any given sense attached to it. Now that's going to be really important. It's going to have important ramifications for philosophical methodology, but I won't talk through those here. Since they're important, I'll start the next video with them.